today we're going to be talking about closing the gender health gap with user-centered medical devices. But first, what is a health gap and what is the gender health gap? So a health gap is disparities in the occurrence of disease, health outcome, experience, or access to healthcare between groups. And the gender health gap looks at that for women and people assigned female at birth. This can be experienced in many different areas of the healthcare journey, whether that be prevention, diagnosis, treatments, health and well-being, so throughout their medical journey. FemTech itself looks at the gender health gap, but when you're innovating within that sector, it's really important to be aware of the intersectionality within that. Not all women are the same, not all their bodies are the same, and not all of their needs are the same. On the right, there are some examples of the gender data gap, of the gender health gap. These are endometriosis. It's a very painful condition that 1 in 10 women suffer from, and 60% of these cases are undiagnosed. Breast cancer, 14.3% of women are diagnosed at some point in their life. Fibroids, it can be anywhere between 20 and 70% of women will have fibroids during their life. And osteoporosis, something that's seen in both men and women, is 3 times more common in women. So what has led to the gender data gap? So medical history has really affected the health gap, as well as social attitudes towards women throughout history. There have historically been many inaccurate theories about women and their bodies, whether this be the wandering womb, whether this be how women experience pain differently, and this is particularly prevalent for women of colour. It continues to influence the gender health gap today. This has led to unconscious bias. We all have these, and these are experienced quite heavily in women's health and women's health challenges. Bias can occur at all different stages of the healthcare journey and can come from various different stakeholders, from medical professionals to medical device developers. So it's important that we all do what we can to minimize the effect of our unconscious bias on patients' healthcare journeys. The gender data gap refers to lack of information about women, and in this context, a lack of information about women's health and women's bodies. This, along with unconscious bias, has led to something called the Yentl syndrome, which is where women are more likely to be misdiagnosed or receive inferior treatment, hence a data gap. So this has led to the FemTech industry, first coined in 2016. This covers a range of different tech classifications, from drug delivery devices to surgical to diagnosis to wearables, as well as a range of different clinical areas, including things that are primarily seen in women and people assigned female at birth, as well as things that present differently or disproportionately affect that group. In order to tackle this, it's really important that it's a holistic thing, that it's industry-wide. You have medical device developers, medical professionals, and drug developers all working together to help close the gender health gap. This requires an increase in awareness and an increase in funding, which gradually we are seeing, and hopefully this can really help to support innovation and ultimately close the gap. So medical devices have a couple of key principles. They want to be user-centered, they want to be functional, they want to be compliant, and they want to be reliable. And FemTech devices are no different to that. They should carry many of the same things.
Thanks, Olivia. So what we'd like to cover today, for the most part, is to dive into some of the actionable things that we can do, especially in the early stages of medical device design and development, to ensure a user-centered design approach that helps to tackle unconscious bias and improve women's health experiences. So I'll first touch on things that we can do in the very early stages of concept generation and design thinking. So looking at the front end of medical device design. And I'll explore 3 different activities that take place in this stage to look at actionable things that we can do. So first off, looking at exploratory user research. Secondly, acknowledging gaps in the system and looking at the clinical pathway more broadly. And thirdly, brainstorming and concept generation activities. So regarding exploratory user research, there's a few different angles that we can come at to look at ways to tackle unconscious bias and close the gender health gap. First off is probably the most obvious one, which is representation and inclusivity. So as Olivia mentioned, there is a data gap for women's health. There is not as much data as one might need on women's health and women's bodies. And an easy way that we can tackle that, or not easy, but let's say obvious, is to try to ensure diverse samples in every effort to do user research. Especially in this exploratory user research stage, ultimately your user requirements are going to be based on your learnings from this research, and it's essential that you're making an effort to have the sample be reflective of the prevalence distribution, different types of symptom profiles and levels of disease burden and other types of demographics that can actually impact a person's experience with a condition and thus your device. And part of this is also acknowledging intersectionality. As Olivia mentioned, there's a lot of different things at play in how people may interact with a device and the types of biases that could be present. So it's not just a box ticking exercise here, but trying to do as much as you can to have a representative sample. When it comes to the study design and language, there are plenty of things that one needs to be considering. But in a nutshell, the first thing is to make sure that you are sensitive to any stigma and creating a safe space for your participants in the study. So a part of this is acknowledging that health in general is very sensitive, and often there's a lot of stigma attached to women's health and basic women's health experiences and certain language and words that are used to describe it. And it's important when doing user research to be aware of that and to give people an open and safe space to discuss these issues without judgment. Part of this is also acknowledging that it's not only your bias that you need to be conscious and careful about, but also the users. And we're all susceptible and sensitive to the historical impacts on unconscious bias in women's health. And that includes the participants in your user research. So it's important to be aware of that. And some things that you can do to acknowledge this are to focus more on observation as opposed to explanation. And what I mean by that is, as opposed to asking people what types of solutions they need and kind of trying to give very specific and guided questions, to try to make an effort to observe how people's journeys unfold and all the kinds of different underlying contributors to their behaviors and their feelings in the clinical pathway. It's focusing on observation, needs, and outcomes, as opposed to explanations about solutions and behind their behaviors. A big part of this is also to try to structure your research in the form of semi-structured interviewing. So what this means is that you've established certain questions that you want to ask verbatim in advance that are aligned with your research objectives, but that you also allow the moderator the flexibility to absorb spontaneous insights from your users. And this is really important for making sure that you have a well-rounded set of insights that are not only informed by your own preconceived notions about the condition. And part of this is also just being systematic and comprehensive. So not only focusing on things that may come to mind first for you, such as people's motivations, people's emotional states during their clinical pathway, but also looking into things like accessibility and barriers and obstacles that are in place for different types of users within the journey. All of this won't matter if you don't have a thorough and thoughtful approach to your analysis as well. And what a few things to think about here are to make sure that you're capturing the difference between insights that came up spontaneously and insights that came up because you asked a specific question. You can really learn a lot from seeing how people answer things differently, depending on whether they had a guided question or whether it just came up on their own. What types of things do people mention when they're just talking you through their journey versus how do people respond to your specific questions about any gaps that they may be experiencing? You can learn a lot from those distinctions. So that's why it's important to have a top-down and a bottom-up approach where both types of insights are being captured and flagged as such. Part of doing this is making sure that you have a systematic thematic analysis approach. So looking through all of the scripts, having kind of some predefined codes or tags that you want to be looking for, but also being open to flagging anything that came up spontaneously, and so that you can compare across participants effectively and rigorously, but also respect and appreciate the individuality that will come out from each participant. And if possible, it's great to have independent reviewers in this process because we're all subject to our own biases. We all often look for what we already agree with, and having multiple people do independent reviews can help to minimize that and get really effective and accurate results. Another important part of front-end innovation is looking at the bigger system. So when you're doing activities like care pathway analysis, some things you can do to tackle the gap here are to focus on identifying all the touch points in this care pathway and acknowledging that in different types of healthcare and different types of care pathways, you might see more siloing. So women's health particularly, you often see a lot of siloing, and that may mean that the experience of who a person is in touch with throughout a care journey could look a lot different than you're expecting. They may see a lot more people than you think before they reach a diagnosis. And that is all relevant to you when you're figuring out where your device fits in the pathway. It also helps because you'll know which kind of members of this clinical pathway you need to think about in terms of any interpretation bias when it comes to your device. And this is the perfect opportunity for you to analyze any gaps that you may not have known about in the past and to explore how the pathway looks different for different patients. When you do journey mapping, you're looking at your innovation specifically and thinking about how you can disrupt this pathway and make it better for people and for patients and for doctors. So here, when you're looking at this, it's important to remember that your device may be used differently by different people. And again, look at a nuanced and representative personas when it comes to your user. So there's not just one journey map necessarily, but there could be different branches. The decision trees could look differently for different people, and different patients might experience the journey differently. Some questions that you can ask yourself in this phase to make sure that you're conscious of your own biases are to look at the data that you're sourcing. Is it sex disaggregated, for example, or is it sex aggregated? Are you able to acknowledge any differences across patient subgroups? Is there a social impact to be aware of? And are there any gaps in the data, which there often will be in women's health conditions, that you might be able to fill in your own user research objectives? Finally, brainstorming and concept generation is, of course, a key part of the front-end innovation activities. And an essential part of this process is the documentation of user requirements. And this needs to be rooted in the exploratory research that you've already done. Some things to remember here are that precedence doesn't necessarily mean requirement. So a lot of the time in women's health, we've come to accept certain levels of invasiveness, certain levels of discomfort in women's health procedures, and have come to accept this as normal. And it's important that we challenge ourselves when documenting user requirements to understand what is actually needed for the user, and is that this is not just based on what's been done in the past. It's also important to acknowledge the entire context of use, to look at the user requirements very holistically, and to acknowledge that these could be different for different people, and to try to document this as much as possible. The biggest challenge probably is to try to make sure that these requirements are kept alive and influencing other requirements and other activities throughout the design and development program. And a good thing that you can do in this very early stage is to try to translate them into design challenges, because you can use these kind of user-centered design challenges to help frame your initial ideation activities and to help foster a user-centered design that is not imposing some constraints on people's creativity. So documenting design challenges that are based on user requirements helps you to create a framework that people can ideate within. And if you establish some well-rounded and weighted evaluation criteria as well that are a little bit more broad, these can come in afterwards to evaluate the ideas and the concepts that you're developing. And this just helps to make sure that when you ideate, you're ideating for the user, and that then you're evaluating based on user requirements as well as technical and commercial requirements, and making sure that all of these are compatible with each other. In an ideation session, it's also essential to try to have as much diversity as possible, because everyone's ideas will be different, and this is all valuable in trying to accommodate a diverse user group. You also want to try to combine fresh and experienced perspectives. It can be really valuable to have some people who are coming to the problem new, but other people who are coming to it with a lot of experience in similar areas. And again, just be aware of comparators here. You don't necessarily want to root this ideation stage in things that have already been done, and try to help people not to be in a box, but rather to be putting themselves in the shoes of the users.
So once you've done your concept generation, you'll be moving on to design development. And with the best will in the world, you are not going to get it right first time. So it's really important that you iterate your design and your concept. So one of the key principles within this is getting user feedback. This will help you to refine your requirements and therefore improve your design and your concept. It is a bit of a misconception in user feedback that you need a fully fleshed out product that has the usability, it has the features all worked out and it's fully functional. That is not the case in these early stages. You can go to a user study and show them 2D images. You could show them handling models. You could show them a rig you've developed in your tech feasibility, all to paint the picture to your user and really provide a rapid way to get good feedback that then can be translated into your requirements and then implemented into your design. In addition to that, sort of kind of how Lara mentioned previously, you want to make sure that you have a diverse team. This diverse team needs to be diverse in terms of background. We all have our own unconscious bias, and having diverse backgrounds helps to reduce the chances that these biases are then implanted and embedded into your devices. It also wants to be diverse in terms of discipline. You want to make sure you have your engineers, you have your designers, you have your human factors specialists and your front end innovation specialists. This all brings different perspectives, and it means that you're less likely to miss something in these early stages where that is really critical. It also means that having a diverse team, people will be willing to challenge decisions. Challenging decisions is asking why. Why does somebody feel that? Where has that information come from? Is there something that we could do better? If you have a natural diverse team that work well together, this should happen fairly naturally and should really help to reduce unconscious bias that's then embedded into your device. At regular appropriate intervals, it's important to do concept review. This is reviewing your concept and the development of the concept comparison to the requirements that you've worked hard to develop in the early stages and that you're working hard to keep iterating. But at this point, you can have your technical feasibility and your usability come together to make sure that you find harmony between the two. However, at points in concept development, you are going to have to find compromises. And in that case, it's important and useful to have a third-party view there, somebody that can help you find the balance in the compromises between functional, user, and commercial requirements, and really do what is right for the product and for ultimately the patient. In these early stages, the decisions that you are making really do set the path for device development and ultimately the final design. So if you get this right earlier on, then it can really help save you a lot of cost and a lot of time later down the road. So we've spoken a lot about requirements, and in order for a requirement to be really valuable, data is so important, making sure that they are measurable. So what are different ways that you can do that, especially given the prevalence of the data gap in the FemTech industry? Secondary data is a great place to start. It can be quick and it can be a low-cost method to collect data for your product development. There are different sources and opportunities to find this data, whether that be university publications. They're constantly doing different research in different areas. Large companies might have collaborations with hospitals where they're also publishing their data that they find, as well as other industries. If you're making something to help support breast cancer, and you're struggling to find anthropometric data, could you maybe look towards the sports bra industry, where they've done a lot to characterize the anthropometric data of that and a lot to understand the sensitivities around the breast? However, with that being said, due to the data gap and proprietary data, there is the chance that secondary research is not going to always give you the answers that you need. And in that case, primary research is a good opportunity. So physicians have a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of experience, and it's really good to try and utilize that in your product development to get the data that you need. They will be able to tell you about variability of anatomy. So how does anatomy change with race? How does it change with age? How does it change with different morbidities? All these things can really help refine your requirements, improve your concept, and make it more functional and usable for your end user. They can help tell you about managing patients, what are their pain points, what are their sensitivities, as well as their general experiences in practice. If you still find that you have areas where you're struggling for data and you just don't have the key areas of knowledge that you need, a cadaver study may be appropriate. This is most commonly used in invasive devices where the anatomical context is very important to understand and very important to characterize. So in these situations where a user study just might not give you the data that you're really looking for, a cadaver study may be suitable.
So before we move on to questions from all of you, we wanted to leave you with a few things, a few questions that you could ask yourself throughout the device development process that can help you to tackle unconscious bias and keep in mind all of these things that have been discussed so far. So I won't cover all of them in the interest of time, but just to touch on a few. First off, as discussed earlier, it's important to challenge the default. Throughout the process, you should be asking yourself questions like, just because it's been done this way before, does it need to be? And that could be for very technical specifications. It could be about the materials you're using and all kinds of other elements that go into your device. You can ask yourself, what should this experience look like in a perfect world? Because we all know that a lot of the products and kind of clinical pathways in women's health have been subject to bias in the past, and it will require mental effort to challenge these. We also talked about the challenges regarding keeping user requirements alive throughout the process. So one question you can ask yourself at different turns that you take is, are the user requirements translated well into these technical and functional requirements? And anytime there's a design change, thinking back to those requirements and asking yourself, does it still fit? Is this change going to affect any users or all of the users? And thinking about that sensitively. And finally, in medical devices, it's very important to also account for biological variance. So the questions you might ask yourself here could be different if you're building a diagnostic, for example, versus a treatment or looking at drug delivery. But you'll need to just assess any potential impact of biological variance and ask yourself the question, am I assuming that one size fits all? Might this work differently in different people? And start to question some of the differences that could potentially have an impact. So for example, height and hand size, metabolic rate, muscle mass, skin color, all of these things can have an impact on the technology that you're using and the impact of your devices and on health outcomes.
Someone has mentioned in the past, there's been examples of, for example, insurance companies having different fees for women compared to men, with women's being higher. Could you comment on how the gender health differences have been handled in the past?
Yeah, that's a really interesting comment, because the acknowledgement that health insurance fees have sometimes been higher for women than for men demonstrates that there is an awareness of the fact that that there are differences, that women are having for example, greater prevalence of certain chronic conditions, that there is a pain gap prevalent, that there is a big burden on women in the healthcare industry. There's clearly an acknowledgement of that, and looking at insurance fees is a good example. What's disappointing and unfortunate is that that awareness and knowledge hasn't sufficiently been translated to the earlier stages to actually reduce that burden. What we want to see is ways to acknowledge that and make reforms to the clinical pathways, to foster medical innovation, to iterate on medical devices, so that instead of just accepting that women's health is complicated and burdensome and women are just going to have more difficulty in the healthcare system than men and will be more expensive, instead rather to try to reduce that gap and to reduce the burden on women's health.
Excellent, thanks for that. So another question we've had is, you've mentioned that observation is a good approach in user research. What does that actually look like in practice?
So there's a few different ways that you can approach any type of study design in user research. And when you're trying to prioritize observation, a couple of different things that you can do could be, for example, to pursue an ethnographic style of research where you are just a fly on the wall, observing how something is done currently, observing how, for example, a surgical procedure is done, or how a patient interacts with their medication in their current in its current state, let's say. Other things that you can do are to have diary writing and similar exercises to help just give people the freedom to provide their insights without being guided by your own leading questions. And I think, yeah, the key priority here is just making sure that even when you are asking questions, that they aren't too leading, and giving people the opportunity to say what would come to their mind first, as opposed to being guided by the language that you're using in your question. Is it very negative? Is it very positive? Is it extremely specific? And all of these things can reduce the level of open reflection.
Excellent. And so another question we've had is, what are some of the actionable ways that device manufacturers can combat bias in medical product design as part of their design and development process?
So that's a really good question. There's a lot of ways in which you can sort of really work to check how you feel and check your biases on things. So we sort of mentioned the need for a diverse team, and that really helps. Bringing in that diversity really does help to reduce bias. But there is a principle which we found quite helpful from a UCLA professor who talks about the 3 different types of bias. So you can have physical bias, which is bias that is embedded into a device. So for example, with some of the monitors that check for heart disease, some of the diagnosis for heart attack, some of them didn't have data that was sensitive enough in order to notice the heart attacks in females because there were lower levels of the hormones that they were looking for. In some cases, you might have computational bias. So this is bias in the data that you're using. So as Lara sort of mentioned before, it's really important to look at the data that you're using. Is it old? What population of people will use to then gather that data? If you're designing something for women and you're using old anthropometric data that maybe it was collected from men in the army, well, that's quite a different population group potentially. And that's important to consider when you're designing your devices. And in addition to that, interpretation bias. So this isn't actually your bias yourself as a medical device developer, but what bias does your user have? For example, color. We always think of color as quite a universal thing, but color is not the same in every culture. So how are you using color, and how is that going to influence your user and your user's bias, and what effect does that have on their experiences?
Thanks for that. So we're getting close to time. I think we've probably got time for just one more question. So what would you say is the biggest challenge that has been faced personally or in the industry when trying to make healthcare more equal?
This is another good question. So I feel like a lot of it comes from historical issues. So I read a book recently called Unwell Women, and that talks a lot through the history of the gender health gap. And there's so many different theories and social attitudes that unfortunately have trickled down through. And those that in and of themselves have now resulted in unconscious bias, which it's very, very difficult to acknowledge those in yourself because, as we say, they're unconscious. So I think that really takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of energy for people to really work at those things and understanding what they are for themselves and the impact that they're then having on their healthcare devices that they're providing. In addition to that, the lack of data, it's really something that we need to work on. Is there a way that we can reduce proprietary data? Is there things that we can do there to really make data accessible? There's an increase in wearable devices, but where is that data actually then going to make it usable in the medical device development process? Really working as a whole industry to try and bridge those gaps can really help push us all along, I think, personally.